Hey folks, and welcome to another edition of Israel Explained. Today we're going to talk about the clear change in policy from the Biden administration regarding this conflict. As you'll remember, the war started with the very clear warm embrace of the Biden administration to Israel. Um, Aid was immediately sent. Biden visited Israel. Hamas was blamed exclusively for the start of the war, and rightfully so. The calculation was simple. Israel is morally right. It's being attacked by terrorists. Iran is the United States' enemy, and Israel is fighting against them. There were even indications that Russia was involved in this, and Russia and Iran are getting increasingly close. There was also a little bit of a sneaky motivation here. The Biden administration felt that if they keep Netanyahu close in a kind of bear hug, they can do more to control his policy, control the way he's fighting the war, and control the way he ends the war. Because, of course, we know tensions between Netanyahu and Biden didn't start on the eve of the war, and the trust between the two governments was not particularly high before it. But Biden made a calculation, and it perhaps was the right one considering his options, that being closer to Netanyahu would serve his purposes more than pushing him away. That has shown some success, especially in the terms of humanitarian aid, which doubtless would not have been delivered to Gaza for a long time, if at all, without American pressure. And of course, from a moral perspective, not necessarily a strategic one, that was the right thing to do. But in many other ways, that policy hasn't borne out. The Israeli military hasn't run the operation quite the way the US wants it to. And what it really hasn't done is created a vision for a day after, agreed to talk about a two-state solution and ending the war and the conflict on terms that the Biden administration is comfortable with. The end result of this is that the US has found itself closely supporting and closely affiliated with a war that doesn't seem to have much direction and might end with a permanent Israeli occupation of Gaza, something that the United States is not comfortable with, nor is the rest of the international community. And attempts to turn this into a diplomatic achievement by linking it with normalization with Saudi Arabia don't appear to have borne fruit. It looks like the positions of Saudi Arabia and Israel are just too far apart from each other to bridge. And to make matters worse, the Biden administration is in this position in an election year. Now, this comfort that the Biden administration has with the war effort is nothing new. We've been seeing that for a month, probably more like two now, but it's never come out to the surface quite as clearly and intentionally as it had in the last few days. You might know the full list of incidents that have occurred over the last 2 days, but I'll just remind you briefly. Biden gave a confusing answer to a question about Gaza, but he seems to have called the Israeli operation in Gaza over the top, though some feel that he was talking about Hamas's response to the hostages. He definitely looked a little bit confused in that answer, and that was unclear. But three other responses have been much more unequivocal. National Security spokesman John Kirby, who's known for being one of the closest allies of Israel in the administration, said that without adequate care for civilians in Rafah, the United States would not support a IDF incursion into the city. He said, quote, right now that would be a disaster for those people, and it's not something that we would support. Because he said that he wouldn't support it unless there were means um, to protect civilians in Rafah, that's not a red light, but it is a significant yellow one. And it's the first time the US has told Israel before a planned military operation that it does not really support it, certainly in public. Meanwhile, on Friday, Biden issued a directive to Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, giving him 45 days to obtain, quote, credible and reliable written assurances from foreign recipients of U.S. military aid in active conflicts. So that's Israel and Ukraine. Neither was mentioned by name, but that's what it's referring to. that they're using military assistance in compliance with international humanitarian law and human rights law and other standards. The directive says that if governments do not supply this assurance within 45 days, or the U.S. determines, even if assurances are given that those countries are not applying the law properly, there will be a pause in U.S. assistance. That is something that the administration was under pressure to do by more left-wing senators like Elizabeth Warren. And the fact that Biden has done so is a signal that it's, again, starting to feel that the Israeli efforts are flirting with breaking various international laws. Finally, John Feiner, Deputy National Security Advisor in the Biden administration, met with Arab American leaders in Michigan, and he apologized to them for the tone that the administration has taken during the war, saying that it involved several missteps. Here's a quote: "We have left a very damaging impression based on what has been a wholly inadequate public accounting of how much the president, the administration, and the country values the lives of Palestinians." End quote. Now, notably, he didn't apologize for the policy of supporting Israel and was very careful not to do that. What he did apologize for is the tone that often came off to Arab Americans as not caring enough about the loss of Palestinian lives. That's significant. So, what we have here is four indications of a change of policy, each one with a caveat. Those caveats are all intentional, but they amount to a change of picture, to a change of policy, to growing impatience with Israeli policy. It has to be noted there's something deeply unfair about this change, especially when you look at the timing, because the timing comes when Israel has rejected a offer from Hamas on hostage exchange that is notably unacceptable, and even the United States has said was unacceptable. But this is a lot of that is frustration that this attempt to stop the war before more damage is done from the Biden administration's perspective failed. And this is politics. Politics are not fair. Um, Now, to put this into further perspective, when the war started and I talked to people in the IDF, Israeli government, they wondered how much time the US would give Israel to complete this operation. The estimates I heard were somewhere between a month and 2 months. Now it's been 4 months and 3 months since the Israeli invasion. So the Biden administration has already given Israel a lot more time than expected. But it feels, and the CIA reports that they're receiving are confirming this, as reported in the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, that Israel is not achieving its goals and knows that it's not being cooperative on the diplomatic front. Nonetheless, there is a serious price to pay for um, flip-flopping on this completely. If the United States abandons Israel and stops sending it arms or does something dramatic to snub Israel, it might lose significantly more support than it gains. After all, 52% of Democrats, according to the latest poll that I saw, support Israel, um, or I should say, support the Biden administration's policy towards Israel. Out of the ones that don't, there is a significant amount that think that Biden should be supporting Israel more. So there really isn't that big a constituency of people who want Biden to become more pro-Palestinian, to control Israel more. They exist and they're significant, especially in Michigan, which is why John Feiner paid attention to them. But um, they might not come back on board if the U.S. makes changes. They may have already have baked in their opposition to Biden, and Biden might lose a larger share of supporters. And I think he's aware of that. Meanwhile, on a geopolitical level, the United States is involved. in a geopolitical contest with China, Russia, and Iran, and cutting off arms to Israel now, along with the inability of the United States to pass aid to Ukraine, would make it look like a very unreliable ally and give a lot of aid and comfort to America's enemies. Biden is fully aware of this. So, what is the point of this change if it's not going fully fledged? There are a few things that Biden probably thinks he can pressure Israel into doing differently. One of those is the invasion of Rafah. I don't think the Biden administration thinks they can prevent it. They may not even want to prevent it. But what they definitely want to do is they want Israel to take as many precautions as possible with Palestinian civilians, something that I fully support and think is a very good idea. Another thing that they're trying to do is they're trying to put pressure on Israel to accept the next offer for a ceasefire and exchange of hostages for prisoners, something that may be a very bad idea for Israel to do if the terms are not good. And finally, they may still be hoping to pressure Israel into paying some lip service, at least, to a two-state solution, something which I think is not going to happen at all. But there is something that Biden needs to be very careful of. He may be playing too much into Netanyahu's hands. After all, Netanyahu is very comfortable posing Democratic presidents and calling them the bad guy in order to reap domestic dividends. And it works. It worked particularly well with Obama, despite the fact that it did a lot of damage to relations with the United States and especially with the Democratic Party. Netanyahu right now faces two major problems if he wants to survive after this war. One is explaining how he got caught with his pants down on October 7th. For that, he's trying to blame the military, and we've talked about that here before. And now, if the war doesn't end on terms that he wants, he's going to try to blame the United States. He's already blamed the United States for tying his hands, and that will play electorally very well with the right, may actually perversely help Netanyahu stay in power. So both sides have electoral incentives to try to change their policy in ways that would cause more friction between the US and Israel. But we have to remember there's a geopolitical contest going on involving Iran, Russia, and China. And the US and Israel absolutely need each other and need to cooperate in order for there to be any success on our side in this incredibly important war. Okay, so I have a couple of questions as well. Hario Super asks, I've seen reports that Israel has started some bombing in Rafah, and Netanyahu has stated an invasion is imminent. Will a ground invasion into Rafah happen soon, or is this likely to be a negotiation tactic to pressure Hamas into accepting a better deal? Um, both. Both. The preparations for invading Rafah are real and credible. Because they're real and credible, they put more pressure on Hamas to change their terms. If Hamas gives terms that Israel can't accept, I think Israel will go in. Netanyahu's been hesitant to do it, but I don't think he has much choice if Hamas isn't willing to come to terms. So it's both, and that makes it more credible, and that's a good thing in terms of negotiations. If a good answer from Israel's perspective is not upcoming, you can expect an Israeli invasion into Rafah. A month from now, Ramadan starts, and Israel's going to want to get that done by Ramadan. So watch that space. FRDZ4KB um, comment on my last video about how Israel could win the war. He says, again, convincing arguments for your theory of victory. Do you seriously see the political capacity in the Israeli government to manage that multi-directional effort? There are so many moving parts, and they probably should have begun weeks ago, if not months ago, to prepare for this eventuality. It probably would have entailed moving some Gazan civilians into Israel proper, where you can properly care for them, which would also take care of the genocide nonsense at the ICJ, but at least set up zones in Gaza where you can move civilians and support them with aid. Getting Egypt on board giving the allies at least token concessions on a two-state solution so that they have something to work with at home and abroad when they give diplomatic cover to Israel. I just don't see them being able to pull that off on the fly. Yeah, so I think that you found the chink in the armor of my theory of how Israel should win, which is that Israel is just not doing what it should be doing in order to win. So we agree on that. But the truth is, Israel's not too far from doing those things, and it's not too late to do any of those things, especially since it's now talking about going into Rafah. The Americans are pressuring it in Rafah to evacuate the civilians properly. And there's also been a pilot program to start distributing aid by Palestinian civilians in the Zaytun neighborhood in Gaza City, which may expand. And the two-state solution element that may have to wait for future government. But if Israel starts a military administration of Gaza now, it can always pivot to a different diplomatic solution later. So all I'm saying here is that nothing has happened so far to preclude Israel from taking the right measures that would allow it to win the war. That doesn't mean I think they'll do it, but I can see a scenario where they do. And if more and more people tell the Israeli government that they should be doing these things, maybe they will. That's what we've seen in Rafah. That's what we've seen with this pilot in Zaytun. A lot of people, more important people than me, are saying similar things to what I'm saying, and that's having some effect. Okay, so I'll be recording one of these again soon as there are new and exciting developments. In the meantime, consider supporting me on Patreon if you like what I'm doing here. And I'm still working on my podcast episode on the 12 tribes. And I will see you here very soon indeed.